May 19th, 1536. A grey morning dawns over the Tower of London. A scaffold, draped in black, stands on the green. A queen, clad in dark damask and ermine, ascends the steps. She is poised, dignified. A French swordsman, an expert in his grim trade, waits silently. With one swift, elegant stroke, it is over. A mercifully quick end for the second wife of King Henry VIII. This is the story we've all been told. It's a neat, tidy, almost romanticized version of a brutal event. It's a historical tableau, carefully framed and hung in the gallery of our minds. But it's a lie. Not a complete fabrication, but a dangerous oversimplification. The truth of what happened to Anne Boleyn in her final hours is not a story of quiet dignity and swift mercy. It's a story of calculated psychological torture, of political theater at its most depraved, and of a final, desperate act of defiance that has been misunderstood for centuries. The sanitized version you know is just the surface. What lies beneath is a far more disturbing reality, a sequence of events meticulously designed to break a woman long before her head ever left her shoulders. So, forget the tale of the graceful exit. Today, we peel back the layers of myth and propaganda to uncover what really happened at Anne Boleyn's execution and why it was far, far worse than you could possibly imagine. The physical act of Anne's execution lasted a mere moment, but the execution of her spirit began long before. To truly understand the horror, you have to look at the 17 days she spent imprisoned in the Tower of London. This wasn't just a period of waiting, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare orchestrated by King Henry VIII and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. On May 2 ND, Anne was arrested and taken to the very same royal apartments she had stayed in before her lavish coronation just 3 years earlier. This was not a coincidence. It was the first of many cruelties, forcing her to confront the ghost of her former glory in a place that now served as her gilded cage. Every day was a new torment. She was isolated, with her ladies-in-waiting replaced by women chosen specifically to spy on her. Every word she uttered, every sigh, every prayer, was reported back to Cromwell. Imagine the paranoia, the feeling of constant surveillance, knowing that the very people meant to offer comfort were your jailers. Her chaplains, men she trusted, were brought in to hear her confession, not for the salvation of her soul, but in a desperate hunt for evidence to incriminate her or to find grounds to annul her marriage to Henry, thus bastardizing their daughter, Elizabeth. Then came the date of her execution. It was initially set for May 18th. She prepared herself for death. She made her peace, took communion, and waited for the end. But the end didn't come. At the last minute, it was postponed by a day. Why? Historians debate the exact reason, but the effect on Anne is undeniable. It was a calculated move to prolong her agony. To give her one more night, one more sunrise, to contemplate her fate. This wasn't administrative delay, it was a form of torture. It plunged her into a terrifying limbo between life and death. Accounts from the Tower's constable, Sir William Kingston, reveal a woman oscillating between moments of calm acceptance and fits of hysterical fear and laughter, a state of mind he described as hysterical. She spoke of her little neck and how the executioner would have no trouble, a morbid joke that masked unimaginable terror. This final delay was the culmination of a campaign designed to shatter her nerves, to ensure that the woman who walked to the scaffold was a broken shell, not the fiery, defiant queen who had changed the course of English history. One of the most enduring details of Anne's execution is Henry's decision to grant her a beheading by sword, rather than the traditional English axe. This is almost always framed as an act of mercy, a final, small kindness from a king to the woman he once loved. This narrative is not only misleading, it's a perversion of the truth. The choice of a sword was a cold, calculated political statement, a piece of macabre theater designed for a very specific audience. First, let's dispel the myth of the clumsy English executioner. While some executions with an axe were notoriously messy, a skilled headsman could and often did perform the task cleanly. The axe was the weapon of English justice for traitors of noble blood. By choosing a French sword, Henry was doing several things at once. He was exoticizing her execution, setting it apart from the norm. And had spent her formative years in the French court, she was known for her French fashions and manners. In a twisted, symbolic way, Henry was ending her life with the very culture she embodied. It was a final, possessive branding of her identity. Furthermore, this act of mercy was a staggering display of royal power and wealth. Sourcing a skilled swordsman was not a simple task. An expert had to be summoned from Calais, which was then English territory in France. This incurred significant expense and logistical effort. The executioner was paid the handsome sum of £23 6s8d, a figure equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual salary. This was not a quiet, merciful gesture. It was an extravagant, public demonstration that the king's reach and resources were limitless. He could summon a specialist from across the sea simply to carry out his will. It sent a clear message to the court and to foreign ambassadors: defy Henry VIII, and he will not only destroy you, he will do so with theatrical flair and bottomless resources. It was a performance of absolute monarchy, paid for in blood and gold, turning Anne's death into a state-sponsored spectacle masquerading as compassion. Who was this mysterious swordsman from Calais? History, frustratingly, does not record his name. He is a phantom figure, defined only by his grim profession. The very anonymity adds to the horror of the event. He was not a public figure, not a known executioner, but a specialist brought in for a single, high-profile task. The legends that have sprung up around him paint a picture of an almost superhuman figure, an artist of death who could sever a head with the grace of a dancer. The reality was likely more prosaic, but no less terrifying for Anne. He was likely a soldier or a mercenary, skilled in the use of the two-handed executioner's sword, a heavy, specialized weapon distinct from a dueling blade. It was a long, double-edged blade without a point, designed for a single, powerful slicing motion. His expertise was not just in strength, but in precision. Unlike an axe, which relies on a downward chopping force, a sword cuts in an arc. This required a completely different stance and technique from both the executioner and the victim. The psychological impact of waiting for this foreign expert cannot be overstated. Anne knew a stranger was crossing the channel with the sole purpose of ending her life. He was an embodiment of the king's implacable will. The myths surrounding his skill were likely encouraged by the crown. The more legendary his ability, the more merciful the execution appeared. However, this also placed immense pressure on the man himself. He would be performing in front of a select audience of England's most powerful people. A single mistake, a botched stroke, would not only be a personal failure but a political embarrassment. The quiet professionalism of this anonymous Frenchman, his silent arrival and departure, made the execution feel less like an act of justice and more like a clinical, predetermined assassination. He was a tool, a human weapon imported for one purpose, and his presence underscored the cold, impersonal nature of the state-sponsored murder about to take place. When we think of Tudor executions, we often imagine a massive, jeering crowd in a public square like Tower Hill. This was not the case for Anne Boleyn. Her execution was to be a semi-private affair, held within the secure walls of the Tower of London on what is now known as Tower Green. This choice of location was another deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. Executions within the tower were reserved for prisoners whose public execution was deemed too risky, either for fear of riots or for reasons of state. In Anne's case, it was about controlling the narrative and maximizing her humiliation. The audience was not the common rabble of London, it was a carefully curated list of about 1,000 spectators. This list included members of the King's Council, dukes, earls, the Lord Mayor of London, and, most chillingly, the men who had condemned her, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Henry VIII wanted his courtiers, his ministers, and the architects of Anne's downfall to witness the final act. It was a stark warning to them all. This is the fate of those who displease me, even a crowned queen. For Anne, this meant she had to face not a sea of anonymous faces, but the very men who had schemed against her, lied about her, and sentenced her to death. She had to look into the eyes of her enemies as she took her final steps. The scaffold itself was a newly constructed platform, raised for the occasion, making her the center of this grim theater. It was a stage for her final degradation. The setting, Tower Green, was also deeply symbolic. It was a place of royal history, but on this day, it was turned into a private execution ground. By denying her a public death, Henry also denied her the chance to become a public martyr. He contained her death, just as he had contained her in the tower's walls, ensuring that the final story told would be his, and his alone. The intimacy of the setting didn't make it more humane, it made it a personal, vindictive, and profoundly shameful ordeal. In the Tudor world, clothing was a language. Every color, every fabric, every jewel carried a specific meaning about status, wealth, and intent. Anne Boleyn, a woman renowned for her impeccable and trend-setting style, understood this better than anyone. Her choice of attire for her execution was her final, silent, and incredibly powerful statement. It was an act of defiance woven into the very fabric of her gown. Accounts describe her wearing a gown of gray or black damask, a luxurious and sober choice befitting the gravity of the occasion. But beneath this dark outer layer, she wore a kirtle, or underskirt, of crimson. Crimson was the color of Catholic martyrdom. While Anne was a champion of the Protestant Reformation, this choice of color was a deeply symbolic gesture. She was signaling that she was dying an innocent victim, a martyr not necessarily for a specific faith, but for the political and religious machinations of the men who had condemned her. It was a visual claim of innocence that words could not express so safely. Furthermore, she wore an ermine mantle. Ermine was the fur reserved exclusively for royalty. By wearing it to her own execution, Anne was making a bold and dangerous assertion. She was not dying as the convicted adulteress and traitor, Jane Boleyn. She was dying as Anne Boleyn, the crowned and anointed Queen of England. It was a direct, visual rebuke to the court that had stripped her of her title. It was a reminder to everyone present that they were witnessing the execution of a queen, the mother of the heir to the throne, Princess Elizabeth. In a world where Henry was trying to erase her very existence, to annul their marriage and declare her a non-person, this simple act of wearing the symbols of her rank was an astonishing act of courage. It ensured that her royal status, and by extension, the legitimacy of her daughter, would be the last thing people saw and remembered. Her final outfit was not a shroud of defeat, it was a banner of defiance. Anne Boleyn's final words on the scaffold are among the most famous and widely misinterpreted speeches in history. The popular myth is that, in her final moments, she essentially confessed her guilt or at least offered a meek, submissive acceptance of her fate. The reality is that her speech was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, a carefully coded message designed to protect the only thing she had left to fight for, the life and future of her daughter, Elizabeth. Standing on the scaffold, in front of the men who had destroyed her, she did not confess. She did not rail against the injustice of her sentence. To do so would have been pointless and would have marked her as a defiant traitor, potentially bringing further wrath down upon her family and, most importantly, Elizabeth. Instead, she played the role expected of her, but with subtle, brilliant twists. She began, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Notice the wording. She says she is judged to die according to the law, not that she is guilty. It's a statement of fact about her legal situation, not an admission of sin. She then offered conventional praise for the king, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." This sounds like groveling, but it was absolutely necessary. Any criticism of Henry would have been fatal for Elizabeth's future. This public praise was the price of her daughter's safety. But then came the crucial line, "And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." This was her stroke of genius. She wasn't asking for silence, she was inviting future inquiry. She was asking history, those who would meddle in her case, to look at the facts and judge the best, a subtle but clear implication that the best judgment would be one of her innocence. She never admitted guilt to the charges of adultery, incest, and treason. She skillfully walked a tightrope, fulfilling the public duty of a condemned prisoner while planting the seeds of her own vindication for future generations. It was her final move in a deadly political chess game, and she played it flawlessly. This is the part of the story that is most often sanitized, the part that truly makes it worse than you think. We imagine a single, clean stroke. But the physical reality of a sword execution is a grim and uncertain science, and the psychological torment of the final moments is almost unbearable to contemplate. An execution by sword required the victim to kneel upright, without a block to rest their head on. This was a position of extreme vulnerability, and would have had to maintain a steady posture, her neck exposed and muscles tensed, while a man stood behind or to the side of her with a heavy, razor-sharp blade. The swordsman's technique was critical. He couldn't just swing. He had to deliver a powerful, horizontal drawing cut, a slice rather than a chop. The goal was to sever the spinal column, arteries, and windpipe in one fluid motion. Any hesitation, any slight miscalculation in angle or power, could result in a horrific maiming. He could strike the shoulder, the jaw, or fail to cut through the bone, requiring a second or even a third strike. While this swordsman was reputed to be an expert, nothing was guaranteed, and had no way of knowing if her end would be quick or a protracted, agonizing butchery. The true psychological horror lay in the final seconds. Traditionally, an executioner would ask the victim for forgiveness, signaling the moment of the blow. The Calais swordsman employed a more cunning and cruel technique. As Anne knelt, praying, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," she was waiting for the blow. One of her ladies had blindfolded her. She was in darkness, every nerve ending screaming in anticipation. According to some accounts, the executioner, realizing she was tensing and anticipating the stroke from one direction, called out to a bystander, "Bring me the sword." This was a deliberate misdirection. As Anne's head turned reflexively toward the sound of his voice, he made his real stroke from the other side, ensuring a cleaner cut on a neck that was momentarily extended and unaware. It was a trick. A final, terrifying deception to ensure technical success, but one that filled her last moment on earth with confusion and a final jolt of fear. The sound she heard was not the swish of the blade, but a lie designed to betray her senses just before oblivion. Anne's ordeal did not end with her death. The final act of Henry's vengeance was the desecration of her memory and her physical remains. After the swordsman had done his work, and her head and body lay on the straw-strewn scaffold, a shocking and disgraceful scene unfolded. There was no provision for a proper burial. No coffin had been prepared for the former Queen of England. This was not an oversight, it was a calculated, final insult. It was a declaration that she was so worthless, so utterly erased from the hierarchy of the kingdom, that she was not even deserving of a simple wooden box. Her ladies-in-waiting, weeping and horrified, wrapped her head and body in a white sheet. They were left to frantically search for something, anything, to place her remains in. What they found was a common arrow chest, a crude, empty box from the Tower Armory. This is what became the coffin for a crowned queen. She was unceremoniously placed inside this rough container and carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the parish church of the Tower. She was buried in the chancel of the chapel, in an unmarked grave. She was laid to rest next to the men who had been executed just days before, falsely accused of being her lovers, including her own brother, George Boleyn. There was no plaque, no marker, no ceremony. It was the ultimate act of damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Henry VIII didn't just want Anne dead, he wanted her to be forgotten, to be expunged from the records of history as if she had never existed. This hasty, ignominious burial in an arrow chest was the brutal punctuation mark on a sentence of utter annihilation. For nearly 350 years, her exact location was unknown, a queen lost beneath the cold flagstones of her former prison. The moment Anne Boleyn was dead, the propaganda machine of the Tudor state roared to life. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell could not afford for her to be seen as a victim or a martyr. They needed her to be a monster, a sinner who had received her just deserts. The narrative of her downfall and execution was immediately and aggressively controlled to justify the king's actions and pave the way for his next marriage, to Jane Seymour, which he undertook just 11 days later. Immediately following the execution, rumors were spread that Anne had finally confessed to her crimes in a private meeting with Archbishop Cranmer. This was a lie, but it was a powerful one, designed to shut down any lingering doubts about her guilt. Continental diplomats, like the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who had despised and eagerly reported the most salacious and damning versions of events back to their home courts. They wrote of her supposed promiscuity, her witchcraft, and her treason, painting a picture of a she-devil who had rightly been purged from the English court. This became the black legend of Anne Boleyn. She was posthumously accused of having 6 fingers on one hand, a physical deformity that was considered a sign of witchcraft. She was portrayed as a cold, ambitious seductress who had bewitched the king to satisfy her lust for power. Her execution was framed not as a tyrant's revenge, but as an act of divine justice, cleansing the kingdom of her corrupting influence. This official narrative was so effective that it dominated the historical record for centuries. It took dedicated historians, piecing together letters, eyewitness accounts, and sifting through layers of propaganda, to begin to rehabilitate her image and understand the true extent of the injustice she suffered. The story we are often told of her execution is, in many ways, the final victory of Henry's propaganda campaign. It's a story designed to make us feel that her end, while sad, was somehow orderly and just. The truth is that it was the chaotic, brutal, and deeply personal final act in a campaign of total destruction. So, the story of Anne Boleyn's execution is not one of a quick, merciful end. It was the terrifying climax of a campaign of psychological torture. A political performance where a sword replaced an axe not for kindness, but for effect. A final speech that was not a confession, but a masterclass in protecting her child's future from beyond the grave. And a final indignity of an arrow chest for a coffin and an unmarked grave. Her death was meticulously staged to be as terrifying and humiliating as possible, a brutal spectacle of a king's absolute power and personal vengeance. But in the end, Henry's attempt to erase her failed. Her defiance, her intelligence, and her legacy lived on through the daughter she died to protect, a daughter who would become Queen Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. Anne's story is a chilling reminder that the neat and tidy versions of history often hide the most horrifying truths. What part of Anne's final moments shocks you the most? Was it the psychological torment, the symbolism of her dress, or the final insult of her burial? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey into the dark heart of the Tudor court as fascinating as I did, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who thinks they know the full story of Anne Boleyn. Thank you for watching.